Welcome back. This video is going to walk you through some ideas from a paper that's unpublished but was presented at a conference a couple of years ago, Tyndale Fellowship Conference over in the UK. And it's a philosophy of religion group. Highly recommend anyone interested in philosophy of religion to check it out. It's annual and a wonderful group of people there. So the title of the paper is called the Identity of Being and Goodness Implies for Natural Theology. And I'm just going to read and make some commentary as we go along. So Aquinas argues that we can know that goodness and being are identical. Now, this seems to entail the existence of a formal reality of existence identical to goodness itself. This paper explores the relationship between this formal reality and a contemporary moral argument for theism, which gives us natural theological knowledge consistent with Christian revelation. So we'll first take a look at Aquinas' 4 ways to good. I think I've got separate videos on these, if I'm remembering correctly, but on the channel I think you can find these. But Aquinas has 4 arguments for good, and this is elaborated in a book by Scott MacDonald a few years ago, and a chapter from that book by Eleanor Stump and Norman Kreitzman. 1991, I think. It's called Being and Goodness. Great little book. Starts out with Boethius, a discussion of Boethius, and then kind of elaborates a medieval scholastic view from there. So the first way that Aquinas has to the identity of being and good is an argument from desire, or appetunt, thetai in Greek, to the conclusion that being and goodness are really the same. The second way, he offers an argument from corruption resistance, with the conclusion that goodness and being, qua complete actuality, are identical. The third way is an argument from essential teleology, or fulfillment, with the conclusion being all final goods are fully actualized being. And the fourth way is an argument from aiming at being, with the conclusion that all being is good. Okay, so I think I'm going to skip the part where I walk through each of these 4 arguments. They're interesting in their own right, but I think I'll just leave that for another time. But each argument tries to show that being and good are identical in things, but distinguishable in our minds. So when we look at anything that has being, we can see that thing as being, but we can also see it as good. It's similar to, although I'm not sure about this, as the distinction of sense and reference by Frege, but whether or not the Fregean distinction between sense and reference and Aquinas' distinction between secundum rem, according to the thing, and secundum intellectus, I don't know if that's the same distinction. So that might be an interesting thing to think about. There's a paper in there somewhere, I know, about this topic, but it's probably closer to the distinction by Suarez of a distinction of reasoned reason. That is, when we make a distinction between being and good, we're not talking about a real distinction in an object. So anything that's real, whether it's an artifact like this cup, or a real thing like this tree, or the water over here in this pool, we can see the being of the thing and we can see the good of the thing, and in our intellects we can separate those, but they're inseparable in reality. They're idem secundum rem. They're identical in the thing, but distinguishable in our minds. So we can see the distinction reasonably, or through reasoning, but it's not real distinction in the object that we're observing or thinking about. Okay, so I'm just going to assume for the sake of argument that the identity of being and goodness in things, secundum rem, is well established by Aquinas. Now, if any of his 4 arguments are, if they fail, if those are untenable, and I've never seen them refuted, maybe you have, I don't know, put it in the comments if you have, or give me a knockdown, drag-out argument against these 4 arguments. I'd love to see them. I just haven't been able to see any problem with them. Probably if they were going to be attacked, it'd have to be at the level of metaphysics, right? The idea that there are no essences, or some kind of strong ontological naturalism might do the trick. But that's a long slog, and I don't know. It just seems like Aquinas' views on this are quite reasonable, that his arguments are deductively valid and sound. All the premises are true. Okay, so assuming that, then where does that leave us? Well, what it leaves us with is Aquinas' four arguments that being and good are identical if they're sound. Then the general conclusion that can be drawn is the following. There's a real identity of being and goodness in things, idem secundum rem. Being and goodness differ only in idea, differentum secundum rationem tantum, within our minds. Again, this is possibly a Suarezian distinction of reasoned reason. Now, a few things seem to follow from this. First, if this is the case, then it will follow that for any existing thing, there exists in that thing an instance of the reality, existence identical to goodness. Thus, for multiple existing things, there will be, for any existing thing, there will be in that thing an instance of the reality, existence identical to goodness. Okay, so in other words, any and all existing things, maybe outside of God, have within them an instance of this reality. Existence is identical to goodness. Thus, for multiple existing things, there will be many instances of the reality. Existence is identical to goodness. Being and good are identical. And now this would be a reality that is present in everything that exists. Second, if there is a reality, existence identical to goodness, that is present in everything that is real, then it is at least possible, perhaps on a certain understanding of universals, that there is a formal reality, existence identical to goodness, existing apart from the particulars, that is instantiated. This could mean that in any set of multiple objects, well, it doesn't have to be a set, but just any group, and people get weird about sets, any multiple objects, O1 through O sub n, each object has the quality of having an identity relation between its being and its goodness. So being is identical to goodness is a property that all things have, or a mode of being, if you want to put it that way. But this seems to entail that being is identical to goodness is a property that exists, could at least exist apart from its instances. If you think universals can exist apart from their instances. I need some metaphysics behind that, but let's just roll with it. So if it exists apart from its instances, then it might explain what unifies all the things which have it. Third, if there is such a formal reality, existence identical to goodness, then this implies that whatever existence itself is, it is identical to good, and whatever goodness itself is, it is identical to existence. Consider the following argument, which appears to flow from Aquinas' identity claims. 1. P is equal. So P in this argument stands for being and good are really the same in things, idem secundum rem. 2. P is true. 3. P is true. If P is true, then P corresponds to reality. 4. If P corresponds to reality, then there must be reality in existing things, which consists of the identity relation IR, the identity being in goodness. 5. If IR really is in any existing thing, then IR will be in all existence, E1 through E sub n. 6. If E1 through E sub n exemplify IR, then one can abstract IR from E1 through E sub n and think of IR formally. 7. If IR can be thought of formally, and given IR exists in E1 through E sub n, then possibly IR is a formal reality that can exist apart from E1 through E sub n. 8. There are good reasons, for example, any argument for formal realities existing separately from their instances could work here, to believe that IR exists apart from its instances. 9. Therefore, there's good reason to believe that IR exists as a formal reality independently from E1 through E sub n. So this argument works for Platonism about universals. For an Aristotelian view, universals are real possibility at least, such that one could say that if anything exists, then IR exists. One might then seek to explain the reality of the existence of IR. In any such explanation, one is explaining both the existence of being and goodness. So let's take all of this now and think about Aquinas' fifth way, not to good. There's only 4 ways to good on Aquinas' view so far, but Aquinas' 5 ways, those 5 ways to God that are taught in most lower division philosophy courses in philosophy of religion, maybe metaphysics, or even intro classes. So this is Aquinas' 5th way to God, from the governance of the world. Let's consider that argument and the identity of being and goodness, which we've discussed so far. Let us consider how the identity of being and goodness, along with Aquinas' 5th way, relate to one contemporary version of a moral argument for God's existence, which takes the syllogistic form: if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Moral values exist, therefore God exists. All right, so here's Aquinas' 5th way. The fifth is quoting from Summa Theologica. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, got some natural bodies around here, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly do they achieve their end. Don't you love Aquinas? Designedly achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence can't move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So the salient part of this passage, that's the end of the quote. The salient part of this passage for our purposes is the notion of acting for an end. Acting for an end. And achieving their end. And those two ideas. This is relevant to Aquinas' understanding of the nature of existence as essential actualization, and of goodness as the completion of the appetent, it's that aim-attedness, desirability, if you want to call it that, of any existing things. This is where the identity relation of being and goodness becomes relevant. It's important to note that acting for an end, in one sense, just is the exemplification of an essence. It's the aim-attedness, or appetent, or desire, sometimes it's in English. I think it's a bad translation, but aim-attedness, I think, is better. Of any existing thing. So when Aquinas quotes Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and says, goodness is what all desire, bonum est quod omnia appetunt, the Latin term appetunt is rendered as desire in English in some translations. But this seems kind of absurd at first glance. Merely physical things, for example, carbon atoms, don't have desires. Got some H2O back here in my backyard. Hydrogen doesn't seem to have desires. The appetunt in Latin might help a little bit. That's where we derive our English term appetite. But that doesn't seem any. It seems weird to say that hydrogen and oxygen mixed back here behind me have an appetite. They're hungry. So perhaps looking at the Latin, we could look at the Greek, where the Latin term appetunt and the English term desire derive. That might be helpful. So carbon atoms aren't hungry. They don't want things, but in the Greek language, the term is apheatai. Greek ain't so good, but every being has a desire or natural appetency in this sense. So apheatai roughly means aim-attedness, like when you're throwing a spear or a dart or something. This seems to help. Any existing thing necessarily in its existence aims at its own actualization, since existence just is essential actualization. I've got a whole book on that. It's called The Heresy of Heresies, Defense of Christian Common Sense Realism. If you want to check it out on the link here on the YouTube channel to Amazon, you can take a look at that. So every being has a desire, a natural appetency, a real aim-attedness in its essence. Further, when that essence is actualized, the aim-attedness of the essence is complete and perfected in terms of its moving from potentiality to actuality, just in virtue of its existence, its essential actualization. This is something we can be aware of when we experience anything that exists. When we're aware of any existing thing, we're aware of an essence that aims at or aims towards, desires, if you want to put it that way, its own existence. This awareness of the natural fulfillment of aim-attedness, natural appetency or desire, is what Aquinas means by goodness presenting the aspect of desirableness, which being and existence understood merely as essential actualization does not have. Thus, the distinction between being and good can be held in our minds, but is really an identity relation in things. So this is what Aquinas is after when he talks about things acting for an end. The aim-attedness of existence of any object doesn't get there by itself. It's in need of explanation. Now, for more complex realities like yours truly and you, dear listener, dear viewer, it's more complicated, but it's the same notion. There will be an ontic order of our existence entailing the identity of our ontic goodness. But there's the full completion of our essential nature as moral beings, not just existing beings. You can't exist as a moral being unless you exist as an existing being, first of all. So the full exemplification of the virtues directed towards our completion is a sunum bonum filled in the beatific vision. That's our ultimate goal, our ultimate end. This account, too, will be in need of explanation, with the explanation pointing to the existence of God. Let's call this a use of the IR relation, the identity relation and the identity of goodness and being, that IR relation, to points to the existence of God. This would entail that any argument that explains the being of any existent is also explaining the goodness of that existent as well. And any argument that explains the goodness of an existent is also explaining the being of that existence, because being and good are identical in things. So let's compare this approach using the identity relation with other contemporary moral arguments which rely solely on the moral order, but don't include IR in the structure of their arguments. What I hope to argue here is that IR can bolster contemporary moral arguments so as to avoid possible contemporary objections to them. Two such objections are: one, objections based on atheological evidence, for example, the problem of evil, maybe even the problem of evil of the putative, gratuitous suffering of animals, non-human animals. I think there's a lot to be said about that as an objection. I don't see it as an objection at all. Maybe this argument will help with that. So I think it's Alex O'Connor. Sorry, I'm not good with names. YouTube, I don't know if he's an atheist skeptic, cosmic skeptic, cosmically skeptical, something like that. Interesting, yeah, very thoughtful and reasonable approach. Thinks that animal suffering counts as a problem for God's existence. And I think this argument that I'm offering here might militate against that. We'll see. All right, so two such possible objections to theological evidence, the problem of evil, and objections based on the absence of moral knowledge. Okay, those two objections, I think, focusing on the identity relation of being and good can militate against those objections. Okay, so let's first look at the identity of being and good and a contemporary moral argument for theism. So let's look at a simplified moral argument with possible objections and see how this identity relation can be used to overcome those objections. So, for example, some philosophers, William Lane Craig, have sought to use the existence of a moral order rationally to imply the existence of God. Take, for example, a simplified moral argument. If God doesn't exist, then objective moral values don't exist. Moral values exist, therefore God exists. Craig makes these kind of arguments regularly in his cumulative cases for theism. The best video to watch on this is his video with his debate with Christopher Hitchens a few years ago over at Biola. It was a really good debate. You should watch it. But this argument is also discussed in print in a book by Baguette and Walls, Jerry Walls, and I think it's Jerry Baguette. Sorry, I'm bad with names, but the book is called The Moral Argument. It's a history of moral arguments from, I think, the modernity up to today. It's a really good book. If you're interested in the variety, there's not just one moral argument. There's a ton of them, and Baguette and Walls do a great job in their book of spelling out what those arguments are. So if you're interested in this stuff, take a look at that book. Okay, as Baguette and Walls state, the conclusion, this is about a Craigian-style simplified moral argument. The conclusion obviously follows from the premises. That's always good. You don't want a moral argument if the conclusion doesn't follow. The conclusion obviously follows from the premises, so detractors need to try calling into question at least one of them. Good. How might that go? Well, let's take a look at the logic here for some clarity. Consider the following simplified moral argument. Here it is. P, God exists, or has being. Q, good. Qua morals exist, has being. 1, if Q then P, 2, Q then P. Okay. Those of you who haven't had a logic class, that's a little modus ponens going on there for you. Okay, so that is, if God exists, then, if good qua morals exist, then God exists, morals exist, therefore God exists. That's it. Okay. To defend the soundness of this simplified moral argument, the theist needs to argue the truth of both Q and P. Right? The theist has to argue that God exists and that morals exist. Now, there's a puzzle that arises here. If the conditional is only treated as the material or truth functional conditional, then there's no necessary relationship between P and Q. Only a truth functional one. And maybe that's enough. Right? In other words, if Q is granted to be true, then the argument for the soundness of that simplified argument hinges on the truth of P, which is God exists. But if the conditional is only truth functional, then the moral argument isn't really about morality at all. It's simply an argument giving evidence for P, that is, God exists, moral or otherwise. To see this, consider that to defend the unsoundness of the simplified moral argument, an atheist can argue for either A, the truth of Q, morality exists, or the falsity of P, God exists. In other words, to show that premise 1 is false, or the falsity of Q to show that premise 2 is false. So let's look at these possible options. Okay, to repeat that last part, I want to back up just a second. To defend the soundness of a simplified moral argument, the theist needs to argue for the truth of Q and P. So the theist needs to argue that God exists and goodness exists, or good qua morals exist. So now there's a puzzle here. If the conditional is treated as a material or truth functional conditional, then there's no necessary relationship between P and Q, and just a truth functional one. In other words, if Q is granted to be true, then the argument for the soundness of the simplified moral argument hinges on the truth of P, the truth that God exists. But if the conditional is only truth functional, then the moral argument isn't really about morality at all. It's simply an argument for giving evidence for P, that is, for God's existence, moral or otherwise. To see this, consider that to defend the unsoundness of a simplified moral argument, the atheist can argue for either A, the truth of Q, that God exists, and the falsity of P, to show that premise 1 is false, or, that's because that's a conditional, or the falsity of Q, right, that morals don't exist, to show that the premise 2 is false. Because it's if Q then P, Q therefore P. Right? So you show that Q is true, P is false, or Q is false. Okay, so the atheist has that twofold strategy. So let's look at these possible options. For option A, an atheist might argue that Q is true, perhaps grant it to be a brute fact. Some of these godless normative realism people kind of do that. This might require giving up naturalism or materialism, but it doesn't necessitate theism. An atheist might argue for the falsity of P based on atheological evidence, maybe the problem of evil, or that animal suffering could come in there, I guess, or the failure of theistic arguments. But once an atheist grants Q being true, the soundness of the SMA is simply reduce the evidence for P. Right? So if the atheist and the theist agree on Q being true, that morals exist, then what we're looking at there is just arguments for God's existence. Okay, but for option B, the atheist could ignore premise 1 and simply deny premise 2. Perhaps one argues that there simply aren't moral realities, simply moral practices. I think the guy that does this godless ideal observer theory, there's a philosopher that does that sort of thing. It's like giant Hume. Sentimentalist Hume, idealist theory. But only moral practices, or maintains some sort of moral skepticism, or maintains something like what Dallas Willard calls the disappearance of moral knowledge. Just don't think there's moral knowledge at all. Here, the evidence for or against theism is irrelevant to the soundness of the argument. So if the atheist attacks the soundness of the simplified moral argument in premise 1, the issue boils down to evidence for theism, moral or otherwise. But if the atheist attacks the soundness of the simplified moral argument in premise 2, the issue boils down to evidence for the existence of morals, and theistic evidence or lack thereof is irrelevant. So a demonstration of the unsoundness of a simplified moral argument simply boils down to either good evidence for the existence of God or good evidence for the existence of goodness. Perhaps there are several ways to strengthen SMA-type arguments. One might be to modify them to abductive rather than deductive arguments. That is to say, premise 1 is not simply a material conditional, but explanatory one. If morals exist, then what best explains their existence is a personal God or something along these lines. I think this is what Craig seems to have in mind in his various debates, like in Craig versus Hitchens. Another way to strengthen SMA-type arguments, and this is where I'm trying to hone in on in this particular paper, is, in order to keep them deductive, might be to introduce the identity of being and goodness. Here, in order, using something like Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, that for all x and all y, if x is identical to y, then for all o, if o of x, if and only if o of y. Okay. So where, in this case, we just substitute x, y, and o for being good in any existent, that is, anything that exemplifies an essence. And that would give us, for all being and for all good, if being is identical to good, then for any object O, if O is good if and only if O has being. Now, if that's true, then if anything that exists, including moral values, then there must exist a reality which is existence identical to goodness itself. Thus, any affirmation for the existence of moral values will give us natural, albeit minimal, theological knowledge. While such a thin natural theology might not give us the God of a particular religious tradition like Christianity, it may, as Dallas Willard says, give us the ontological space for the God of religion. That's from Willard's little paper called Language, Being, and God. It's really nice little chapter in a debate between Kai Nielsen and J.P. Moreland. Dallas was invited to contribute to that, and there's a nice little paper that he has, chapter commentary that he has on that debate. I commend it to you. So consider again the atheist's two possible routes to demonstrating the unsoundness of a simplified moral argument. A, the truth of Q equals good called morals, and the falsity of P, which is God exists, or God has being, to show that that premise 1 is false, or B, the falsity of Q to show that premise 2 is false. Now, if Aquinas is right, then option A, defending Q, entails the existence of a formal reality, existence identical to goodness itself. But that also implies that a thin view of P is true. That is, there's a thin view of P that God exists is true. So if Aquinas is right, then any defense of Q entails that premise 1 is true. Any defense at all of goodness existing entails necessarily a thin view of theism. Can't get around it. If being and good are identical, this is a major challenge. Okay. Now, if Aquinas is right, then showing the falsity of Q would also entail that there's no being either, if being and good are identical. Of course, that's absurd. So if Aquinas is right, then either theism is true or the atheist's denial of Q is absurd. Right? So that's a major challenge for the atheist, right? Approach on this. So the use of identity and being a good in a moral argument might be able to make something like a simplified moral argument more like a cosmological argument, or something more in line with Aquinas' fifth way discussed above. If anything exists, then God exists, where there's a tight metaphysical relation between being and God. And if there's an identity between being and good, then any affirmation of being entails an affirmation of good, and vice versa. And the affirmation of either appears to entail a formal reality, the identity of being and good, independent from any particular being or good. This opens the ontological space for the possibility of seeing the truth of Jesus' claim that no one is good except God alone. Thanks for watching.